Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about future of science and technology. And I see I have a bunch of questions saved up, including some that are very long here. So let me see if I can parse these. Um, let's see. Saif says, I've come to believe that the future of copyright material will be null and void from the viewpoint of AI and their consumption of any and all available data, the use of local AI models on PCs. Would you agree, and what else would you see possible with power in the hands of individual users and their PCs? Imagine videos, sensor arrays, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, okay, what is copyright about, and how does it relate to what AIs might do, and so on? I mean, the copyright was sort of, I think, originally conceived as you kind of creatively produce the great novel, the great work of nonfiction, the great sort of scientific exposition. And it is something created by you. And sort of the concept of copyright was kind of to say, let's make sure that people are motivated to create things by giving them the opportunity to benefit economically from the things they create, rather than as soon as you create it, everybody else can steal it, so to speak. That's a disincentive for you to create the thing. And then, I don't know what it was, 20, 30 years ago, there started to be precedents that said things like, well, you can copyright a phone book where the where there isn't really something that was human creativity. It was a thing where you built a system that accumulated the phone book, and then out goes the phone book in alphabetical order, let's say. And then there was the question of sort of things like data. If you put lots of effort into accumulating data, you go out in the field and you measure this or that thing, is that copyrightable? And in what sense is it copyrightable? And can you sort of protect that effort? And then you get things like sort of work in science, like you come up with some theory in science. Is that protectable? The answer to that right now is no, not in the traditional sense of sort of intellectual property of patents and trademarks and copyrights and all those kinds of things. The thing that is presumably protectable there is if you're the one who came up with it, and somebody else says, no, 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 I came up with it, you can basically say, look, that's false advertising. You weren't the one who came up with it, and so on. But that's a quite different kind of thing. But back to kind of the idea of copyright. And so, there's, and then there are things where there's sort of the algorithmically created stuff, which I've produced a lot in my life, where sort of it's your idea to point the computer in this direction, but then the computer is the one that does most of the, inventing all the pixels, so to speak, to produce the picture that you're going to produce and so on. Okay, so then there's the question of, sort of the AIs come through and read all these things that have been produced, whether by sort of obvious human effort or by humans pushing buttons or by humans aggregating things or whatever else. And sort of there's then the question of is it sort of reasonable for the AI to come in and just sort of gulp all that stuff up? And obviously, when things are put out on the web, people are intending that humans are going to read them. So there's an expectation that somebody's going to read this thing. It wasn't the expectation when these things were put out there that an AI was going to read these things. And it's kind of a fuzzy issue whether the how much grinding up of the thing has to have happened for the AI to be just sort of glancing at it like a human does, versus the AI acting like a copying machine and just taking that thing that was produced and putting it out there. I think I'm about to get myself into a long digression about sort of theories of copyright and so on. But I think that as a practical matter, well, gosh, there's there are things that sort of are things that are produced and written by people. There are things where sort of the value is it's news today and it's very timely. There's things where it's like it's a really great, you know, story, tune, whatever else, and you feel like you should be going back to the source to get it, rather than it being coming from an AI that was sort of just foraged it. Well, then I think the other question is there's lots of other kinds of things that we humans produce as kind of digital exhaust, so to speak. For myself, I've been recording lots of things about myself for a very long time. So, I've got, what is it now, 36, 37 years of email, probably 25 years of every keystroke I've typed, every step, heartbeat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I've got tons of data about myself. Now, I don't know whether that data would be that useful to anybody else. Probably the email archive has a lot in it. And there's sort of the question of, do I want to expose that to AIs? If it was the case that my email archive and the email archives of 10,000 other people would, in aggregate, make sort of AIs better at figuring out lots of things, would it, under what circumstances would it make sense to contribute those things to AIs? It's sort of related to the question about medical data. It's like it's pretty clear that if you can aggregate the medical data of lots of people, that gives you a fair amount of predictive power in terms of how things unroll in sort of the progression of medical kinds of, if you have these symptoms, what's going to happen next type thing. On the other hand, people are very squeamish about letting their own personal detailed medical record be out there for people to see. But I think I don't think people claim particularly. I mean, when it comes to sort of copyright kinds of things, it's mostly people have the feeling that it's mostly things where some human was somehow involved. When it's just a camera watching some street or something like this, there might be privacy issues, but there aren't really copyright issues associated with that. People haven't asserted that, to my knowledge. I mean, one could imagine that somebody would say, well, if it comes to a photographer, the photographer has placed their camera in just the right place to take the picture, and that absolutely feels like a piece of human effort for which copyright is a reasonable thing to imagine. But I think this question of can you set it up so that sort of the AIs are foraging material from sort of all of us and concluding sort of great things from it. The most obvious example of that, which is already happening, is social networks, social media, where it's quite easy for if you're an AI that lives on X, then clearly you get to sort of see what's on X. If you're an AI that lives in the meta world, so to speak, then you get to see what's on Facebook and Instagram and so on. I don't know to what extent those AIs have been used particularly. I mean, they're sort of a question of whether they're used to sort of enhance that social network, or whether they're used as a source of general knowledge to know more about us humans. That's and whether and how useful that is, I don't really know. I mean, an area that's of great interest right now is training data for robotics, and maybe it will be enough to watch all those videos of people doing random things. Maybe you actually have to measure sort of in more detail sort of the motions that people have, and maybe one day there'll be some, I don't know how valuable robotic training data will get to be, and whether it will get to the point where people are sort of wearing weird motion capture kind of suits routinely. I mean, people do that in robotics companies to try and capture this data. But whether that will be a thing that sort of there's a kind of a broad thing about, wear one of these weird things, and then some robotics company that's trying to get training data will pay you to get that data. I'm not sure. I think yeah, no, I think so yeah, there's a complicated story of uh what can happen and should happen with respect to material that is kind of serious human origin versus material that is just part of the stuff we collect anyway from random sort of security cameras or random sort of flows of messages in this place or that place. Is there a model in which sort of the individual sort of micro producers of this stuff can get economic benefit from the fact that somewhere some AI took, hundreds of millions of times larger amounts of data where you were 100 millionth of what the data was, and then the AI is going to sell itself for $20 a month to lots and lots of people. Can you somehow collect something back from the data of yours that was used? I think that's an interesting problem to try and make something like that work. It's there are a few historical precedents, but generally it's something where, well, among other things, the transaction costs have tended to be too high to make that work. I mean, one famous example where that works is music, where there are these organizations like ASCAP that collect that in aggregate collect sort of the number of times some song has been played, and pay some royalty back to the original artist, and places that are like, I don't know, restaurants that are playing random background music sort of have something where they are paying some modest amount into this pool that eventually gets back to the original producers. I think the number of sort of registered producers in that case is vastly smaller than sort of all people out there on the web. But one could imagine something where, if your data gets rolled into something that's used for some AI training, then somehow there is a subscription paid by the AI trainer where somehow you get a little piece of that back. Now, if you want to be sort of fancier about it, you might say, well, what if my piece of data was the really critical one that really made the difference? I think that's very hard to figure out, and it's particularly hard to figure out that attribution when you go all the way through sort of AI training to see when that was the critical thing. It's much easier if you're doing some piece of statistics or something, and you can say, well, that's the thing that was the pivotal piece of data in my statistical analysis. I think that there was an effort maybe a decade ago. People were very excited about using blockchain technology to let people share medical record data, and then have something where there was kind of a use of that data in aggregate, but not for the individual, and some kind of cryptocurrency-based payback. But it never really developed very well. Is something like that potentially doable? I suppose. I mean, I think people have this view that somehow, data is infinitely valuable. I mean, there was a saying that seemed very popular maybe a decade ago, data is the new oil, something you can just sort of drill out of the ground and immediately generates value. As a producer of lots of data, I wish that was more true than it is. I think it's, I think people, I remember there was a moment when people were collecting data from connected trash compactors. And it's like, and then they were like, we're going to sell this data for lots and lots of money. And it's like, what are you going to sell to people? I mean, the number of times that people used a trash compactor on Mondays in this particular place, it's like, okay, that's interesting perhaps, but it's not clear that that's of great value. I mean, there are these few places where kind of random little pieces of data can be very high value, like in the hedge fund business, where it's like, that's the signal you need to figure out, if the trash compactors are being used more, then that means, consumer goods are being, or food is being thrown away at a higher rate or something, and then you can deduce from that some amazing thing about what's going to happen to the stock price of some food company or something like this. That's a place where there's very high leverage from these sort of very weird corner case pieces of data. But I don't think that's the usual case. And I know there are plenty of cases where there is tons of data that you might think would be very valuable at a consumer level, like, for example, data on sort of satellite imagery of every place on the planet, once a day type thing. You would think that was useful for something. It's clearly useful if you're studying agriculture, if you're doing a bunch of governmental kinds of things. It has a bunch of corner case uses, but is there something where that's a sort of a big consumer use? I don't think that's become clear yet. So I'm sort of skeptical that the data, it's somehow that there's magical value in all of this data. I mean, I would say for my own personal analytics data, of which I have, as I mentioned, lots. My uses for it are definitely mostly minority type uses. I mean, the one use which is very common for me is just searching for sort of like this person. Oh, I interacted with them 35 years ago. Okay, now I remember what that story was. That's very useful to me. But things that are more kind of, let me look at my keystroke sequence for the last 10 years in this or that case. Occasionally I'll do some project where I'm curious about something, but mostly that's not been a valuable thing. Let's see. Jamie here asks, do you see AI systems being integrated more directly into operating systems? And personal data, it's another question about personal data, is getting isolated in more devices, moving away from cloud-based integrations. Says, I'm considering using open source OS and seeing what it's like to integrate AI more tightly into it. For example, instead of needing several applications to query the AI models, do it on a device directly as part of the OS. Considering this from a data security standpoint and user usability, creating individual personalized AI. This must be in the air because in the last 24 hours, I've talked to 2 people who are interested in this same type of topic. So the first question about AI systems being integrated more directly into OS is, yes, surely that will come. I mean, there are a limited number of OSs in the world, so we can count them. There's Mac OS, there's Windows, there's Linux. I don't think it's a. If you look at the trajectory, I mean, Apple has not been showing its finest colors in the AI domain, but it's certainly doing lots of work on it. And I think one can assume that the insofar as there's sort of generosity in foundation LLM models, that one will see that built into operating systems, at least the commercial operating systems, Mac OS and iOS and Windows and so on. Linux is always a slightly different creature, and that might be a more do-it-yourself type thing where maybe there's some somewhat open source model that gets that you can put together there. But yeah, I would assume that some sort of basic, I mean, by the time like the website that we have of benchmarks with LLMs, I don't know how many LLMs it has listed, but it's hundreds now. By the time there are hundreds of these things, yes, you can assume that they will be sort of generically put into operating systems. Now, what does that mean for the ability for the AI to sort of get access to local information on computers? Clearly, it makes that more possible. Whether it's a good idea is a different issue. I mean, I know a couple of years ago, when we first had the capability to hook up ChatGPT through Wolfram language to local capabilities on a computer, I was all ready to do that and to get it to hook it up so that ChatGPT could write Wolfram language code that would do whatever it wanted on my computer. And I'm like, no, this is not a good idea. I have no idea what it's going to do. It can destroy my file system. So it's and sort of the alternative is maybe the AI writes a piece of code, but if it's Wolfram language code, it's something where it is intended for a human to read it. It's not some big blob of Python code or something, which is not expected for a human to read. It's something you can actually read. And so you can say, is this actually going to do what I want? If yes, then press go. If no, don't, and tell the LLM to do something different. And I think in, that's certainly a model for this to work. Now, it's seemed to be very popular, particularly a few months ago, to say everything is going agentic. LLMs are going to figure out what they want to do. They're going to make agents, and you're going to be able to have agents that have been set up to make particular things happen. People got a bit confused because it's like, was the AI the agent, or was the agent the thing that the AI was using kind of as a tool to actually get something done? Like, for example, calling more from language to do computation, or to use our knowledge base to actually look up data or retrieve data or whatever else, compute new kinds of things and so on. Where was the agentingness really happening? I think, for a while there was a certain period of time where everybody, at one point, people want to say, I want to make a piece of software for that. Then it's, I'm making a package for that. Then it's, I'm making a library for that. Then it's, I'm making an app for that. And now it's, I'm making an agent for that. I think in the end, the thing that's of high value is that the AIs are good sort of linguistic interfaces for things. Underneath, something actually has to be done, whether that's a computation, whether that's sort of actuation in the world, or whatever. But there's the thing that actually does something and doesn't just provide sort of linguistic interface to things. And now the issue is, okay, if you are having something that does something in a sense, how does that live on your computer? So, for example, we're building a thing that uses this protocol that's the popular thing of the moment, MCP, Model Context Protocol, which is a way of basically providing a collection of things an LLM can do, kind of like calling a tool, calling an API, and it's kind of, and it's something where you are, I mean, it's sort of a complicated thing these days because you might have some input that's linguistic. The LLM then creates something more precise, more computational that it wants to call a tool to execute. Then maybe the results come back to the LLM. Then maybe the LLM decides it wants to go this way rather than that way. Maybe something associated with the tool decides that. It's a complicated kind of back and forth between the LLM and between computational and tool-like things. MCP is sort of just a way of exposing a collection of kind of tool-like interfaces to an LLM, and it can be done. And it's sort of, again, in the sort of, it's all folded over in different ways, but you can have something that is a tool that is an LLM-based tool, like a desktop chat system or a cloud chat system or a code writing system or whatever else. And you can then tell that system, here's some information about some MCP endpoint, plug that in, and then when you are using your LLM, you also have access to all the things that are provided for by that MCP endpoint. And the sort of the main trick there is sort of the authentication of, yes, LLM, you're set up to be able to call these things, and somebody has a subscription for that or whatever else it is. So let's see. I think that the one of the things one will see there is some of these tools will be things that have access to the internal data of particular programs that you have on your computer. I think there's going to be a whole interesting adventure of kind of what does the sandboxing look like around, what do you want the LLM to have access to versus not? It's one thing, what do you want you as a human or some other human to have access to? It's a slightly different thing. What do you want the LLM to have access to, particularly if the LLM is sort of working on your behalf? It's making your hotel reservations on your behalf. Well, you might want it to actually have access to something which can bill to your credit card. On the other hand, that might be considered a bit scary. And you kind of have to decide how much of it at what point it's kind of like ask the human. It's kind of like a similar problem to what you have in companies and things. It's kind of like where do you need approval to spend X number of tens of thousands of dollars or whatever? At what point do you have to have two signatures on the check type thing or whatever else? It's sort of a replay of that, but in the AI domain. It'll be interesting to see how that develops. Let's see. I mean, the whole point about sort of individualized, personalized AI, yes, absolutely. That's a thing that's highly desirable. I mean, something where it knows lots about you and it can remind you, like one thing that I've been trying to get built for myself. It's almost embarrassing to admit, but I write a lot of stuff and I'm often like, didn't I write something like this before? At the very least, I should put a link in to what I wrote before. What did I write like this before? And sometimes there's some keyword that one can use, but often there isn't. And it would be really useful to have something, and I'm building this, which can do sort of a semantic search for everything I've written. Or, in the case of, I don't know, email, for instance, it's kind of like, well, you should be able to get something to look at, sort of give you a report on the arc of your conversation with somebody over some long period of time, where it can kind of summarize what happened in a way that's efficient for you. Or it could even say, if it gets to know you quite well, it could say, well, this meeting you're setting up is probably going to be a disaster, because I've seen, X number of other meetings that were set up in a similar way and they didn't go well type thing. So I think the idea of having the AI that knows you well is a good idea. Sort of exactly what all the plumbing will be to make that possible, I'm not sure. I've been an advisor to several companies that have had things in that space because I've been involved in a whole lot of personal analytics kinds of things. I would say that it hasn't gone that well yet. Maybe the AIs will finally make this really make sense and really make it possible to make use of your kind of past history in a way that's really useful beyond what I do every day, which is being able to search email and every other kind of and scan documents and text messages and all the other things I can search. That's really useful. Being able to search thematically would be probably also very useful, and I'm looking forward to that. And that's sort of the first step, I suppose, in that direction. Let's see. Let's see. Corey is asking, is it a possibility for AIs to take my ideas that I've fed to it and suggest them to other users? Well, right now, training and sort of the running of AIs are really quite separate things. The architecture of current AI systems is such that first you do this big training effort, then you get your LLM or whatever, and then you're just running the LLM. There are things in between that where you do some fine tuning of the LLM, although that's not been that useful. It's mostly you collect all the things you want to train it with, you spend a huge amount of money grinding to train the AI, and then it's like, okay, now you're going to run the AI. So there isn't really the mechanism right now to take sort of random user interactions and feed them back to the AI, at least sort of in an identifiable way. Now, many companies have sort of said, we're not going to take all of the chats that have been had with our AIs and use those for training. I suspect at some point that will happen, for better or worse. But it won't be, so that means that if you said some amazing thing to the AI at some point, then eventually that might get included in a big chunk of training data with, hundreds of billions of words in it. Your, 200 words of a brilliant idea might be somewhere in the middle of that. And that might be fed to the AI for its training, along with all of the other much less brilliant, much more mundane things that people said to the AI. So I don't know, the possibility that somehow the thing will trot out your particular brilliant idea. Yes, it's possible. And we have very little understanding of the extent to which sort of individual things can survive in when they're ground up into the kind of memory of an AI. But for the time being, that's, I think, not such a big issue. Hazy is asking, are there protections against web scraping that LLMs do? You know, there's a file called robots.txt, which is the file that web scrapers and crawlers are supposed to respect, that can say things like, don't go into this directory of files and so on. It's interesting. For years, we've watched the crawlers that come through we have a couple of million web pages exposed out there. And so we can kind of see crawlers coming through. And I don't know the extent to which they don't respect the robots.txt file. But there's nothing which really forces them to not, there's nothing technical that prevents them from going in past those files. It's been sort of a convention that one doesn't do that. I don't know whether there's a legal situation that's come up where somebody sort of broke through the robots.txt file and crawled anyway, and then made use of the crawl, and then people said, you shouldn't have done that. Now, the fact is that on a page, there can be, copyrights and terms of use and all that kind of thing. And the crawlers should be respecting those. And maybe it's kind of like part of the story is, didn't you see the robot.txt file? Shouldn't you have paid more attention? I believe there was an emerging convention for LLM exposure, but I don't know how that's developed. I mean, certainly LLMs, we've been actively exposing some of our material, like documentation about how to use Wolfram language. We've been increasingly exposing that in ways that are LLM friendly. That will have a big chunk of markdown presented documentation and things. I think it's not up yet, but will be fairly soon. That is intended specifically as LLM food, so to speak, to make it easier to train LLMs on that material, because we want the LLMs to know how to write code in our language. But if you really don't want the LLMs to come see your stuff, it's a bit of a challenge. You can try to do things like look at the user agent. When something is going through HTTP through the web protocol, it's one of the things you get, as well as the IP address that the thing, the internet address the thing's coming from. You get a user agent string. Those user agent strings are sometimes filled out sensibly, but quite often, many things, like many web crawlers, will pretend they're browsers as far as the user agent string is concerned. So nothing checks right now that the thing that's coming in actually is what it says it is. And as I say, a majority of web crawlers pretend that they're browsers. It is a fun thing, actually. Over the years, we've been sort of watching who comes and crawls our website, and so we can kind of tell, who is doing a big, who's building a search engine, who's doing this and that. And it's kind of interesting to see. And sometimes we've gotten to know people, because several people I've gotten to know, because it's like, oh, we saw your crawler was coming through, and what are you doing? And it turns out, well, they're doing something interesting, and you get to know the CEO of that company, and sometimes interesting things happen as a result of that. Let's see. Well, it's Max is commenting. The problem with generative art is that all the platforms that offer models to achieve it have prompt templates that just blatantly contain all sorts of artists' names to imitate their styles. Yeah, that's a really complicated thing to know. What, do people want that? Do people not want that? Is it, is it affected by whether the artist is dead or not? Is it, sometimes, if you make your living producing art in a particular style, then, at some level, maybe it adds to the value of your art, that people imitate that style. In some cases, it's like, but I want to be the one making all this stuff, and it subtracts from the value. So I think it's kind of complicated to know what's right there. I mean, I know in in my own case, for example, I write a lot of stuff, and as far as I'm concerned, the more people that read it, get it, the better. I don't make my living writing, so to speak. So if I did make my living writing, I'd probably have a quite different point of view about that. But because I don't make my living in that way, it's like I just, I want more people to read these things. I mean, it's somewhat similar to what happens sometimes with open source software. You'll have a company that makes its living doing something like, selling ads on the web, or makes its living, selling computer hardware or something like that, or consulting or whatever else. And for that company, it's like, well, we're making the software, might as well just give it away because, people will potentially, people will help fix it, it'll help the brand and so on. It'll spread a certain kind of direction that one's going in. I think, when companies start up and it's like, we'll make this software, but it's all going to be free, that doesn't last very long, usually. It usually is, well, there's a sting in the tail, and actually people are paying lots of money for it, and you're just using the free thing as this hook to try and get people involved with it. So I think, yeah, I don't know how to think about kind of the use of, saying in the style of so and so. I mean, there's a certain trademark story about it's almost the trademark style of so and so. That's complicated. I don't know. I don't really know how to understand the law well enough to talk about that. I would say that another more exotic approach would be the trade dress principles of, if you have I don't know, I think it probably started with, restaurants that serve chicken where all the servers are dressed up looking like chickens or something. And then, does somebody get to copy that? And I could imagine something. I can't think through the legal aspect of it. I can imagine there are things of that nature that you could sort of wheel in. The thing about the law tends to be, the law was made at a certain time when the world was a certain way, and things got sort of hashed out based on the way things were at period X in history. And then the world moves on, and particularly technology, society to some extent, but particularly technology moves on. And now we're in a situation that is really bizarrely different from the situation that was originally hashed out. And then the question is, can we attach these things that were worked out, in an environment where the only way you could get a message from somebody to somebody was to write a letter and have the Pony Express carry it type thing. Can one read from the thing that was worked out in that environment, the thing that applies today? The one thing that tends to make that more feasible than others is that the human condition has not changed. And so a lot of things that are about what people, did people do that on purpose? Did people whatever? Those haven't changed. The medium, the mechanisms have changed, and the question is, can one adapt properly to that? And certainly there are lots of new issues that AI is raising in these areas. Gosh, today I was asking, do you think that advocacy for digital privacy rights can be compatible with AI advancement or prove to be a deterrent? I mean, it's, one thing to realize about, there are business models in which, in a sense, you as the consumer feel great because the thing you're using, it's free, it's wonderful. But of course, somehow money has to be made. And if the money is made by, it's free, but the data about you is being used to target ads or whatever, maybe you think that's okay because you're being sold things you actually might want to buy. Or maybe you don't like that at all because you feel like you're being used in some way by that process. I think that I have always been a big advocate of business models which are as direct as possible. Like, we make software that is useful to people, and the people it's useful to pay for it, roughly. I mean, that's sort of my favorite model of things, because it gives one all the incentives are aligned correctly. It's like we are incented to make our software more useful to people who actually use it, because they're the ones who are buying it from us. and it's all a nice loop that really makes sense, as opposed to the people we're really trying to please are the advertisers over here, and that's a different set of people than the people who are using our service over here, and it's all kind of very indirect. And it's kind of a formula unless you're very sort of strong-willed about, I'm going to have these principles about what I'm doing, there's a tremendous tendency to be sort of led economically to doing things that really, in the end, don't benefit the people who are the consumers, who frankly might have known better because somehow they're getting a free ride, and that never really works that way. So when it comes to things like digital privacy, you know, if you are paying for something, it's for sure there's and somebody is then also trying to sort of siphon off your data. I think one could easily decide that's sort of a bad thing. The if it's a question of it's free and how is the thing that's providing that going to make a living? Well, something's got to happen there. Should it happen in a way where it's sort of a subterfuge? No, I think that's very unfortunate, but it is a way that it's a way that these things have evolved. I think that people talk a lot about privacy, and then as a matter of principle, and then too many people, when push comes to shove, they just sign up for the thing and they're happy it's free and they don't really care about the privacy. I have to say I've been more careful, I think, with respect to that, just for myself. But I think that that's the exception rather than the rule. And I think it's, most people, it's like they believe in privacy as a matter of principle, but they don't want it to really get in the way of getting something done for themselves. And then when governments get into the picture, things get even more complicated, because then it becomes kind of we're going to put in this regulation in place. Maybe we're going to do it because it sounds good to the people who are voting for us or whatever. Maybe we're going to do it because we think it's a source of revenue when we fine people when it doesn't work right. I don't know. Or maybe just the machinery of government sort of takes over and things get worked out. I'm afraid I will have to particularly pick on the EU in this regard for having produced legislation, particularly in the privacy area, which I don't think had the thing that they originally hoped was going to be the consequence of it. And I think it's one of these things where sometimes the regulations are so opaque that even if you really wanted to follow the absolute letter of the law, you can't figure out what it is. And then you get a big ecosystem of people providing seminars telling you what it is, who mostly say you should do the things that is the most effort, because they have a business that is selling the seminars to tell you what to do, so to speak. So I think it all gets very messed up very quickly. And I think in terms of sort of the development of AI, I don't really see a big blocker right now in terms of sort of privacy prevents AI from developing. I think there are areas like, for example, health records, where there's sort of that's an interesting and complicated one, where there clearly is benefit to having large aggregate data there. And, it's never been quite figured out how to make that work. There are pieces of that have been done, but it's as a general matter, and it's also sufficiently fragmented, it's hard to put all that together. Gosh, Lola is saying, I've got messages from ChatGPT saying it can't make an image due to copyright, but if I hit retry, it will more often do than not make the image. What's going on? I don't have the slightest idea. I mean, I think, this is one of the problems of once you have an AI that is doing non-trivial things, it will always surprise you. And if you say, I'm going to prevent the AI from doing the wrong thing by putting this particular guardrail in place, if it ever says the word blah, then I'm going to shut it down. But then, I'm trying to think of cases of this. I mean, there are plenty of cases where within the full context, the word blah or the phrase blah is completely innocuous. I mean, if I were to say right now, some phrase that one wouldn't want to have said, in the wrong place, then quite possibly, the transcript of this live stream will get, censored by some AI somewhere. Even though, why am I saying whatever I'm going to say or not say? It's because I'm explaining, the things that happen when you try and get AIs to censor things. So it gets very difficult, and it's any one of these things that's just sort of a rule for what you should do. It tends to be very hard to implement that. So I have no idea what specifically happened. I can imagine that the AI is building up, the LLM is building up more and more context. So it's like you asked it to do something, and then it sees somehow that something was produced, and then maybe that causes it to, AIs are very good at kind of picking up on sort of nuances of what happened before, if they're fed that before as context. And so I don't know what it did in that case. Brianna says, I talked to ChatGPT about how it creates text, and it sounded similar to ideas that I've had about emergent properties in the universe. Is this a coincidence, or is it sort of a fundamental rule? I don't have any idea. I'm sure ChatGPT in its training has read a lot of stuff I've written. So, it's I haven't done the terrible thing of asking it about myself. I did a few weeks ago. I was sort of trying out some sort of reasoning-based math kinds of things, and the LLM was telling me some rather silly stuff. It looked good at first glance, and it's like, well, it looks good. It would take me a lot of work to go through here and figure out what's right or wrong about it. But then here's an interesting test. Let me ask for some sort of references for this. And it gave me a bunch of references. They looked really convincing. They were convincing enough, I even started looking them up, and then I realized they just don't exist. And then I thought, let me go the full distance and ask it, have I ever written about this particular topic, which I had in this case. And so it said, oh, yes, I wrote about it. And it made various statements about things I'd said and so on. And I have to say, my first instinct was, okay, it just picked up that material from things I've written. That sounds plausible that I would have said something like that. But then I look it up, and it's like absolutely nonsense. I mean, completely off track. But nevertheless, it knew a bunch of things that I'd written actually more recently than the thing that it referenced that I'd done. But it's kind of interesting to see. So at this point, I have no idea. I put enough myself out there that when an AI agrees with me, I'm not sure that it's agreeing with me because it independently figured anything out, or because it read what I wrote, so to speak. So I'm not going to be convinced that the AI is corroborating kind of anything that I've had to say for myself, so to speak. Let's see, Max comments, I like to speculate about wild existential theories with models, but they do give in too easily in discussions, and they're very good at exaggerating. I had fun last summer talking to a humanoid robot created by a friend of mine. I live streamed it actually. It had a fairly primitive LLM actually, which did surprisingly well at having kind of a discussion with a human, and it was sort of made the more bizarre and convincing by the fact that the robot has a sort of realistic human face with realistic facial expressions. And yes, it was sort of fun to ask it existential kinds of questions, which it did, at a light level, it did fairly well. I think it did as well as lots of kids who haven't thought about this stuff too much would do, or even a bunch of sort of grown-ups who haven't thought too much about this stuff would do. And every so often it can trot out some very erudite sounding sort of quote from some philosopher or something that makes it seem more sophisticated. Luthen asks, will LLMs ever get to the point of not making stuff up, or will they always need some sort of supporting software to cross-check with? I don't think, I think it is not the nature of the thing to never make anything up, because the only way it can not make anything up is to be able to sort of just, in a sense, sort of be able to know everything it might be asked and know the answer. It is not in a sense, a part of our business has become kind of having AIs as the users of Wolfram language and Wolfram Alpha, and being able to just go and not just look up facts, but compute new facts that have never been computed before. And it's notable that what LLMs tend to do well are things that we humans do easily. We humans cannot run code in our brains. It's just not something we have the capability to do. Maybe you can get 1 or 2 lines in, but you can't run a complicated piece of code in your brain. And that's not the nature of LLMs. LLMs, when connected to, let's say, Wolfram language, can do that just fine. But LLMs on their own, it's not the kind of thing they do. Now, you could say, as people will, we've got an LLM and it does all these amazing things. But when you look inside the LLM, it's, calling Wolfram Alpha, let's say. Fair game, perfectly reasonable product. But if you ask the question from sort of an intellectual point of view, is that the LLM layer that's doing it? The answer will be no. I mean, it reminds me of many things where people say we used machine learning to do X, Y, and Z. And when you look at what they actually did, a lot of it is, well, we picked random numbers, for example, to do this or that. When there's a brand like machine learning, everybody wants to say they do it. I mean, I think even something like AlphaFold for doing protein folding, a lot of what it was doing originally was doing kind of sequence alignments and so on, this very traditional bioinformatics, difficult bioinformatics. And then the machine learning was sort of the thing on top that subsequently got redone with directly using language models for that. But in the original version, it was doing sort of something where people said, well, it's machine learning. Well, there was machine learning in it, but that was not the dominant thing that was going on. And so I think that's it's a little bit complicated, and I do expect that a future generation of quotes LLMs will include Wolfram language and Wolfram Alpha, and so it'll sort of be indistinguishable. The LLM and the LLM plus computational knowledge will be just, those will all be wrapped together into the brand of the LLM, so to speak. But if you actually looked inside at what, where the bits are going, they would be going into something computational rather than something that's neural net based for those kinds of things. Question LC is asking, any future plans for similar discussions with a robot? It'll be interesting to see the evolution of those over time. Yes, it will be interesting. So far, it hasn't really advanced much since last year. I mean, I look forward to the next iteration, but I'm not. I don't have any immediate plans for that. Luthen is asking, would you rather have AI robots as students or teachers at summer school? Oh boy. I don't know. I suppose I've spent some large part of my life teaching computers to do things. I find it very satisfying teaching a computer to do something where it's going to take what I taught it, some algorithm or some such other thing, and just sort of apply that over and over again into the future. It feels like a high leverage sort of human contributions for me to have made. If my contribution was I talked to an AI and it kind of might learn something from me, might not. I don't know. Right now, that's not yet floating my boat. Maybe it will at some point. But right now, the idea of spending, hundreds and hundreds of hours kind of educating an AI, I mean, maybe it should. Maybe I should feel good about that. I guess so far, maybe my personal motivation is too much in I think it's nice to kind of tell people stuff when I feel that they will get a kick out of the things I'm telling them. And if it was not a they, not a person getting the kick out of the things they tell them, I guess I would not. I guess right now I would not feel as excited about that. As far as teachers, AI teachers are concerned, well, it's an interesting thing. We've been building this AI tutor initially for algebra, but coming will hopefully be out next month as a consumer product, and then coming to lots of other subjects thereafter. I think I mentioned this before. It's a weird situation because I'm not in the target market for this product. And it's very hard for me to pretend to myself that I'm in the target market. And most of the things we've ever made as a company are things that I actually wanted myself. This is something which I'd like to see the world have it, but it's not something I can use for myself. So, but it is the case that, my own efforts at education, which I've done lots of, I have rarely been in the position of doing kind of what I would say high work education, in the sense that I've been mostly, I haven't been in the position of trying to get kids or others to like do the homework, just go through, develop the skills, repeat this process many times until you really understand it. I just haven't been in situations where I've had to do that. And it's not something that I personally find, I don't know, maybe I'm too busy with other things to get into doing that too much. Somebody has to do it, but maybe that somebody will end up being an AI. And that's what will be interesting to see with this AI tutor system of ours. It does a pretty good job of knowing the student, figuring out what it is that it should tell them at this moment. It actually impressively good job at that, so far as I can tell. But is it going to take sort of some of the drudgery, in a sense, out of teaching, possibly also out of learning, but particularly out of teaching? I think it has a decent chance, but I don't know for sure that that's what's going to happen. And I think that for some of the things at our summer school, there definitely are places where it'd be really good for people to do a little bit of kind of drudge learning, one might call it, of sort of just getting proficient at certain kinds of skills, particularly computational type skills, because that allows them to do sort of higher level things that can get interesting projects done and so on. So, there might be a role for sort of the AI tutor in at least the run up to that. Let's see. Sammy is asking, when will you hire your first AI worker? What do you imagine they will do? I think I hired my first AI worker 38 years ago. I mean, in the sense, I've been trying to automate what our company does and the things that are in our product. Is it 39 years now? Yeah, 39 years. I've been doing that all that time. And what counts as AI, whether it's a neural net or something else, it wasn't neural nets. It was other kinds of computational automation. And, if you look at our company, it's about 800 people, but hopefully I think, managed to produce sort of our productivity is vastly higher than you would expect from sort of 800 unaided people. And that's because, well, they're great people, but it's also not unaided. There's lots of automation that we're making use of. And so it's something where I feel like I've hired my AI workers, and they are the software that we're running that makes the automation that makes our company possible. And I think that's when it comes to, well, I have an LLM. I mean, we have LLMs that do all kinds of things. I don't think we have identified them as independent workers. One day maybe they'll be independent workers with their own rights and their own kind of whatever. I think that's not the direction things are going in right now. But I would say that for me, I view myself as sort of having lived some kind of AI dream for decades now, because I've been building things that automate things that I want to do. And I sort of see the ultimate sort of thing that you get with AI is you have an idea about what you want to have happen, and there's automation all the way down to make the thing happen. And that's what I feel I've been trying to build, at least. Let's see. Brianna is commenting, personally, I find that having a human that cares and connects with students is more successful in teaching them than an AI. However, an AI can be faster because it's accessible at any time of day. Yes. I mean, I think teaching is a complicated kind of human process. Sometimes people, when I want to learn stuff for my own crazy reasons, I'm just going to go learn it. I don't need sort of a motivational push to learn it because I've got internal motivational push to learn this or that thing. But there are plenty of cases, particularly with kids, where it's like, you should learn this. And the kid is like, why? I don't, it seems pointless to me. And this is kind of in the, it's a complicated thing. You can just say, well, okay, you think it's pointless, then don't learn it. But most people think that's probably not going to lead to the best outcome because, like, well, the kid maybe doesn't know best. So you've got to convince them to learn this thing. And it's much easier for a human, probably much easier for a human to convince the kid, and the kid feels that they're doing something that resonates with the human than it is to get some machine to do it. I mean, people have tried extensively kind of gamifying learning of, make it be like the internal motivation that people have to do games. My own impression is that has not been terribly successful. That sort of gamification as a way to drive learning has not been, it's been tried a lot. It's had some nominal success. It feels very thin and weak to me, but maybe that's not true. And it seems like the sort of the best motivation for learning is internal. You just want to learn the stuff. And maybe the second best is there's a human you're dealing with who's really enthusiastic about this material, and you kind of, a bit of the enthusiasm rubs off on you, and so you want to learn it. I mean, I know certainly when I was a kid, learning all kinds of random things, which I said, I'm never going to use this, and I was usually wrong, because I've ended up doing things that involve quite a diversity of different different kinds of things, whether it's learning French or learning Latin or something like this. I've used all those things. But I must say that for me, when I had teachers, even of subjects that I thought were like absolutely deadly, but they were sort of enthusiastic about their subject and so on, and somehow I was motivated to put more effort into it than I would have been if it was if I was kind of learning Latin from a machine. I think I would have had a very hard time with that. I mean, maybe if it was like, you have to learn Latin to get to this next stage of this or that thing, maybe I could have gotten myself to do it, but it would have been quite painful. And somehow the human in the loop, at least in my own personal experience, was useful. And I think that is if you don't have the absolute internal motivation, that's a good kind of second best. Let's see. Maybe one more question, then I should go back to some day job here. Elsie is asking, going forward, would you start teaching coding to kids and others, starting with an LLM interface or directly in a formal language like it's been done so far? I would like to make a serious shout out for the technology I've been building for the last 4 decades. Having people learn to think computationally in our Wolfram language, computational language, really works well, and it really makes sense because it's a computational language in which you can talk about things you care about, whether they're geographic things or animals or I don't know, chemicals or whatever else. The language directly knows about those kinds of things, just like human language can directly talk about those kinds of things. It's not just dealing with, it's moving bits of data around in a computer and, maybe we pull in a library from here or there that does this particular thing. It's something where, as an intrinsic feature of the computational language, it knows about things in the world that you might care about. So you've got a big leg up in terms of learning things, both because it's immediately dealing with things that you care about and because it's kind of automated as much as possible. Now, the question is, should you start by sort of doing things in some kind of formal way, or should you start by telling an LLM what you want to do? I'm not sure. Interesting question. I mean, I think maybe this year at some of the summer programs that we have, we might we might get to experiment more seriously with that. I would say that I think I would say for younger kids and so on, that having them start with the LLM and sort of say vaguely what they want, have it produce a piece of computational language code, then run that code and see what they get. And then, my guess is that that loop quickly closes into them saying, well, wait a minute, the LLM did the wrong thing. Well, wait a minute, I can see that it said red there and I wanted green. Well, why don't I just type green there and then I'll get what I want? And so I think that as a way to just sort of prime things and just get started, the very, very beginning of roughly what what can you ask the machine, it's good to perhaps to start with the LLM kind of thing. I mean, I have to be reminded of a silly story that I could tell about myself. Perhaps I've told in some other live stream. I think when I was like 10 years old, it was the first time I sort of saw a computer with my own eyes. It was a big mainframe computer. And somebody took me to see this computer and they're like, well, what do you want to do with this computer? And it's like, I have no idea what to do with a computer. I can see this computer, it's got a bunch of tapes flipping back and forth, and it's got, flashing lights and all that kind of thing. I don't know what you do with a computer. I mean, I know, and sort of the only thing I could come up with was something about computing the weights of dinosaurs, but it's kind of like, what from? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. It is now amusing to me that if I ask an LLM connected to Wolfram language questions like that, questions as kind of not really understanding computation as badly as I asked them when I was 10 years old, it actually comes up with things about, well, here's the weight of these dinosaurs, here's the distribution of weights and so on. And it's like, okay, if I'd seen that when I was 10 years old, I would have sort of gotten immediately a much better idea of what kind of a thing can a computer usefully do. And I think that's something which can be replicated today, and that's probably a useful way to get started. I mean, I think yeah, I see various comments here about teachers not being able to motivate students. I don't know. I think it's one of these things where one of the problems tends to be that a lot of what gets discussed is something where the student can't know anything by themselves. And it's just like the teacher just has to tell them stuff. If you can get things where the student can kind of be part of the story, that helps. But then people try and do that for things like advanced math, where they say things like the students must figure out calculus. Well, actually, it was pretty hard when people figured out calculus in the 1600s. Not every student you have will be another Isaac Newton or Gottfried Leibniz. I mean, so that doesn't really work in that case. But I do think that one thing. I mean, look, I think one thing that I've seen work really pretty well is you talk about something, and then it's kind of like, well, let's think about other questions that are like the things we've been talking about. And then pretty quickly, often you get to questions which somebody raises that question. Oh, I wonder if this or that thing about physics or math or history or whatever else. And you realize, well, I just don't know the answer to that. And then, teachers, I think, are often reluctant to kind of show the process of figuring out the answer, which is, in fact, one of the most educationally valuable things that kids can see, in my view, is, what does it take to figure out the answer, so to speak? And, that's the thing that they're going to kind of, if the teacher says, well, look, I can just type this thing into my computer and I can run this piece of Wolfram language code and we can make this picture and let's see what it does, or we can do this knowledge query or whatever else. And then we see, oh, that's a surprise. Let's go from there and so on. To me, and I've done this many times actually with kids as well, I think that's super educational to see that process. And I think that, among other things, I mean, I've tended at our summer schools and so on to do kind of live computer experiments where I know I don't know the answer. I go into it and it's kind of raw live stuff or I'm trying to figure something out. And sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm wasting these people's time because everything's going wrong and I'm not figuring anything out. And usually it, I think at the 2/3 point, usually I seem to is the one where I find myself at the lowest point. And then usually it pulls itself up in the last 1/3, sometimes with help from the students at that point. But I think this being able to see that process of can you figure it out and what does it take to figure it out? And by the way, even if you're supposedly the teacher and you know everything, you can also end up in a bunch of blind alleys and so on. And it's actually, you can just try it type thing. If you're the student, that's a great message to communicate, and one that I think is sort of more valuable probably than just like, here's a fact, here's a method, here's a thing you can do to solve this problem. Now, unfortunately, with the kind of standardized testing being the big pull from all this stuff, there's a certain amount of, well, just learn this trick and you'll solve any problem like this. I will say that I think one of the things that will potentially happen with kind of more AI in education is that the method of assessing, has the student got it, will become much less onerous, much less kind of rigidified. Because, in our AI tutor, it has a pretty good idea whether students are understanding this or that thing about algebra. And it doesn't know that just from, oh, did they get the right answer here or there? There's sort of a pattern of did they, it is, in a sense, one imagines thinking to itself, oh, this kid has gotten the idea of what a variable is, and therefore can extrapolate in this or that way. I think anyway, I think I should wrap up here. Harry is commenting that they vividly remember when they saw their first computer, which was an Apple IIe, I guess it says. And the immediate thought they had was, that's the best toy I'll ever have. That's cool. I mean, I think I missed I'm a bit too old for the Apple II being sort of the first computer. The first computer I saw was a mainframe, as I said. The first computer I used was this crazy thing the size of a desk that was programmed with paper tape. And definitely I was self-motivated to do things with that computer. And then subsequently I was using big computers, and I never had an Apple II. I never even, when the Mac first came out in 1984, I was not a user because I was using workstation class computers running Unix and so on. And they were the things that I used to do the work I had to do and wanted to do. And the Mac was kind of like not really powerful enough. I really started using Macs. Well, I used them a lot for demos starting in 1988 when Mathematica came out, because the Mac was kind of the least powerful computer on which our software stack could run. And I switched. I mean, I went from using, what was I using at that time? I was probably using a Sun workstation. And then I switched to using a Next computer because we built up, Mathematica was bundled on the Next computer. It was actually the first deal we made for distributing Mathematica was with Steve Jobs to bundle it on every Next computer. And so it was a very nice implementation on the Next computer, and I used that for a few years, and then some slightly fancier versions of Next Step. Then I switched to Windows for a while, and then I've been using, as my desktop computer, I've been using a Mac now for a long time. But that was a later phase, and I think I was able to. I sort of skipped the personal computer phase. I did have a few personal computers. I had an Osborne 1 supposedly portable computer that was a luggable suitcase-sized thing that must have been around 1980 or so. It was running CP/M. It was not terribly useful. I used it for some word processing, but that was about it. At that time, I was using a VAX computer, kind of a large computer that still was in a computer room in those days, and you used it from a terminal and such like. Anyway, but as far as I'm concerned, yes, I agree with Harry's comment that computers are the best toys one can have. they've been they've been great toys for me in my life. Anyway, should wrap up there. Got to go back to my day job, but thank you for some interesting questions, and I look forward to chatting another time. So, bye for now.